All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to uncover 12 invisible mental traps that are silently dictating our everyday decisions. You see, we really like to think of ourselves as incredibly rational creatures, just navigating the world armed with pure logic and reason. But the reality? Our brains are constantly taking sneaky little shortcuts behind the scenes, heavily influencing how we perceive absolutely everything.
Are you a logical thinker? If you're like most folks, your brain just instantly went, well, yeah, of course I am. And what's really interesting about that is while we all think we make choices based purely on facts, our brains are actually taking a massive amount of irrational shortcuts. We are hardwired with cognitive biases. These biases constantly distort our thinking. But here's the good news. Once you understand how they work, you can actually start to catch yourself right in the act. To make sense of all this, we've organized these biases into 4 main themes. First, how we distort reality. Second, outside influences and outcomes. Third, the ego and justification. And finally, the ultimate bias, blindness.
Okay, starting things off with theme number 1, how we distort reality, or basically, how our minds actively warp the input before we even start thinking.
First up is the availability heuristic. This bias explains why we tend to drastically overestimate the importance of whatever information is just floating around, right at the front of our minds. Usually, this is based heavily on dramatic news or gripping stories, rather than, boring, cold, hard statistics. It's exactly why so many people believe terrorism is the absolute biggest threat to the country, because it's constantly leading the television news cycle, which artificially inflates our sense of danger.
But let's look at the actual reality here. Statistically speaking, you are vastly more likely to be taken out by a falling television set. Literally 55 times more likely, in fact. You're more likely to be killed by a cow or a falling coconut, or even the police who are hired to protect you, who are statistically 130 times deadlier than terrorists. Yet the news makes us feel the exact opposite because, well, breaking news stories about rogue coconuts just don't generate the same ratings.
Next up, we have 2 closely related traps, confirmation bias and selective perception. This is where we actively seek out, filter, or interpret information solely to validate what we already believe. For example, if you're firmly convinced that sugar is terrible for you, you're not going to search for health benefits of glucose. No way. You will instinctively Google, how toxic is sugar, specifically seeking out articles that tell you you're right. And selective perception takes this even further. Picture a passionate soccer fan who happens to be a smoker. While watching a game, their brain will subconsciously filter out and ignore all those negative anti-cigarette ads lining the stadium, but they will hyper-focus on the ads related to soccer. It's like a subconscious shield to protect their existing habits. Wrapping up our first theme is the ostrich bias. Just like an ostrich burying its head in the sand, this is our subconscious decision to simply ignore negative information by pretending it will magically go away. It is literally exactly why we procrastinate on a massive assignment hoping it vanishes. It's also why smokers will frequently gloss over stark health warnings on cigarette packs, just assuming they are somehow the lucky statistical outlier who won't face the consequences. It fundamentally promotes ignorance as a defense mechanism.
All right, let's jump into theme 2, outside influences and outcomes. This is all about the external skew.
Let's talk about anchoring bias. This one is wild. It shows that the very first piece of information you receive becomes an unbreakable baseline for your brain, no matter how totally arbitrary it is. Like, if I ask you right now to guess if the tallest tree in the world is higher or lower than 1,200 feet, your brain instantly anchors to that 1,200 number. You'll guess relatively close to it, completely influenced by that initial random prompt.
Look at how powerful anchoring is in daily life, especially with money. Say a car price drops from $30,000 down to $20,000. Bam! It feels like an incredible steal because you're anchored to that 30. But flip it around. What if that exact same car goes from $10,000 up to $20,000? Suddenly it feels like a complete ripoff. It is the exact same $20,000 car, but your perception of its value is entirely dictated by whatever initial anchor you were given. Then there is the bandwagon effect, where we do or believe things simply because, well, the rest of the world does. We literally jump on the bandwagon without thinking. It heavily impacts elections when people just vote for whoever is currently the most popular, or the stock market when people frantically buy a stock just because it's rising. It also creates this highly dangerous groupthink in corporate meetings. If 9 people in a room agree on a genuinely terrible idea, the 10th person likely just won't speak up, perfectly silencing what could have been a brilliant counter-idea.
Now let's look at outcome bias and survivorship bias. Outcome bias makes us judge a decision purely by how it turned out, rather than the logic used at the time. Imagine a manager who ignores all the data, blindly trusts his gut, and luckily makes the right call. Outcome bias makes us falsely praise him as a total genius, even though his method was completely reckless. Survivorship bias is similar. It makes us obsessively read articles about the morning habits of millionaires, completely ignoring the thousands of everyday people who did the exact same morning routine but never made a dime. We only ever look at the survivors.
Think about survivorship bias in history. We look at a centuries-old city and praise the ancient builders for their extreme engineering, because their buildings are still standing today. But we're only looking at the tiny 10% sliver that actually survived. We completely ignore the massive 90% of buildings that were poorly constructed and washed away centuries ago. We judge the past solely by what happened to survive into the present.
Moving right along to theme number 3, the ego and justification, how we aggressively protect our choices.
Choice-supportive bias is just fascinating. It's the deep psychological need to defend a choice and ignore all of its glaring faults, simply because it was your choice. It's exactly why you'll fiercely defend buying a Mac over a PC, happily ignoring any technical flaws while pointing out every single glitch on a Windows machine. It's why people passionately defend deeply flawed politicians they voted for. Or, on a lighter note, it's why you think your dog is the greatest animal on Earth, actively defending it even when it poops right in the middle of your living room floor. Hey, you chose it, therefore it must be perfect.
Overconfidence bias happens when past successes make us arrogant enough to abandon facts altogether. Imagine a stock trader who randomly picks 5 winning stocks in a row. Suddenly, their ego inflates and they think they have a magic touch. They start making high-risk decisions purely on their gut. They completely forget the gambler's fallacy. Actually, scratch that, they ignore the mathematical reality that if you flip a coin and get heads 5 times in a row, the next flip still only has a 50% chance of being heads. Past luck doesn't equal future success. We also have the placebo bias, which is a surprisingly powerful tool. This is where simply believing that something will have an effect actually causes that effect to physically manifest. If a doctor gives you a literal sugar pill but tells you it's a powerful medicine, your absolute belief in that cure can actually help your body recover quicker. Dozens of experiments prove this. It proves the immense, tangible power of positive thinking. Interestingly enough, the source mentions the reverse of this, is the nocebo effect, where believing something will harm you actually makes you physically feel worse.
All right, let's dive into our 4th and final section, the ultimate bias blindness, the final trap.
This is the blind spot bias, sometimes hilariously called the bias bias. It is the profound belief that you, personally, are far less biased than the average person. You're probably sitting there thinking that other people are easily swayed by the bandwagon effect or anchoring, but you rely heavily on pure facts and statistics. The supreme irony is that, despite everything we've just covered in this explainer, you likely currently believe you are immune to these traps.
Let's look at the blind spot in action. Say a student gives a teacher a really nice gift, and the next week gets a great grade. That teacher will swear up and down that the gift absolutely did not influence their grading. They believe they are totally objective. But if you ask that exact same teacher if other teachers in the school are biased by student gifts, oh, for sure. They will confidently say, oh, absolutely, yes. We can easily see the bias from a mile away in others, but we are completely blind to it in ourselves. So, what does this all mean for us? The absolutely crucial point to take away from this explainer is to continuously challenge your own baseline assumptions. Every single one of us is susceptible to these invisible forces. So, the next time you find yourself making what you assume is a purely 100% logical decision, just pause. Take a breath and ask yourself, which of these 12 biases is currently pulling the strings behind the curtain? Are you truly thinking clearly, or is your brain just taking the easy way out? Think about that for a second.